Hello and welcome to episode 131 of the Lookout Sir podcast. It's me, Philip, this time, because Dan has sadly left the room, which we'll get onto a little bit in a second. So it's a bit unusual, me doing this intro. There will be a little bit of rambling going on, I'm sure, throughout. But this is the first episode where it is a solo show, just me on my own, no Dan in sight. This episode, we're going to be talking about some of the Warhammer previews that were announced just a few weeks ago. It's taken me a bit of time to get round and reviewing them because when the reveals came out, myself, Dan, Richard and Tim were all at Warhammer World, about to do a doubles event that weekend. So on the Friday, we were up in Bugman's playing a game of Richard's Dark Water for the first time, and on our little phones we were also watching along with the reveals, and I was basically watching them on a tiny screen half upside down. So it took me a few days after getting back from Nottingham to actually get a chance and watch the live show, but as soon as I did, it was great to sort of watch the actual stream. But prior to that, I was obviously just watching the the articles as they were dropping, which sadly was not really in sync with the live show. So that is this episode. There'll be a brief bit talking about Dan and the future of the podcast. And then if you can stick around to the very end, I've got some Patreon questions and comments, which I'll be going through, and the classic 5-star review. There will be, sadly, no transitional noises. I feel like I need to develop my own transitional noise and not steal one from Dan. So we're just going to go to the next section. And one final thing I want to mention when it comes to the New Year preview, and that's I'm just covering everything to do with 40k. So the Red Corsairs, the Eldari Corsairs, the Iron Warriors, I think that's it. But then I'm also talking about the Heresy reveals as well, so the Custodes and all the Heresy vehicles that were shown off as well. So those are the topics for this episode. So in this bit of the podcast, I'm just going to do a little spiel about the future of the podcast and talk about Dan leaving the show, which for many of you would be a bit unexpected, I guess in part because it was quite a sudden departure for everyone involved, even for Dan, but also he sort of needed to keep his cards quite close to his chest as things were progressing. So Dan has a fantastic career opportunity working somewhere else from his previous job. And he's absolutely delighted about that. He will be starting, at the time of recording, his new job tomorrow. So best of luck, Dan. We wish you well. I hope you enjoy it. He will hopefully, once he's settled into the job, be able to explain where he is and why he can't be on the podcast. He won't be able to come on to explain it. He will probably do a social media post about it, I am sure. Maybe I can reveal it once he's given me the green light. There was one comment on our post about him leaving that was completely spot on. So one person has guessed correctly what he is doing and where he has gone. Maybe some of you could obviously tell from the breadcrumbs that I am dancing around, so to speak. Dan's final swan song was the end of the year quiz, which was great fun to have us all together to record, including Richie, who put together the quiz, and Tim as well. So thank you for everyone involved. And also thank you, listeners, for hopefully checking it out. It was fun to do the scorekeeper and Timmy, as always. That's my sort of contribution to the episode. So you can see them feature on the YouTube version, which has a lot more visual panache to it than the standard audio-only version. And then since then, I did a Patreon post, which I had opened up to literally everyone. You could comment on it, even if you weren't a Patreon member. And I promoted that on social media to get some feedback about the general direction of where the podcast could go. A few of my options that I can remember off the top of my head was, firstly, just to quit and stop doing it, which would be nice and easy for me, I guess. But then I would have to fill the void of not recording the podcast in some other way. Then one option was to carry on the podcast, keep it audio only, which would be a lot easier to do. Then there was like a video version or a combination of video and audio only. And then also the slight technical issue is that prior to doing Lookout Sir, I had my own Beyond the Tabletop YouTube channel where I did tutorial videos, and still, even since doing Lookout Sir, occasionally did, but nowhere near as regularly as I used to. So one option actually is to preserve Lookout Sir as the two-man format show and actually start putting my own stuff back on Beyond the Tabletop and just using that free time to sort of pivot over to my old channel. I think for this episode, I'm going to do a bit of a hybrid where there's going to be an audio-only podcast, but I've also filmed it all with some video and some screen capture. Not the highest quality, I'm afraid. I'm still trying to work out the system that I've got in place. Potentially, I might need to invest in a better laptop because the one I'm currently using is, I think, 10 to 15 years old. It's at least 10. It might actually be even longer. So I think it's struggling under the weight of the age, basically. So that is something that hopefully, if I'm going to go down that route, it will improve over time. The other thing to bear in mind is actually doing videos taken a lot longer to edit than I was expecting. So potentially I will sack that off because an audio only format would be easier. But I think hopefully after a couple of episodes, I can streamline what I'm doing and it will all be a lot quicker and a bit smoother. So that's the hope. So I think this episode, fingers crossed, I will be putting out an audio only version alongside the full episode in video format on YouTube under the Lookout Sir banner. But then what I might do is edit the individual sections down into bite-sized snippets that I'll put on Beyond the Tabletop just to see how it's received on both channels. The overwhelming majority of votes was wanting me to carry on with at least a solo show, probably audio only. So this is me trying to push myself a little bit further by adding in some video stuff into it. So hopefully this is what you want. Again, I'm very open to feedback, constructive criticism, let's say, rather than just mean comments, please. So yeah, let me know down in the comments or just message me on Instagram. It's probably better, Beyond the Tabletop or the Lookout Sir Instagram, because they're both me now. And spoilers, they always were. So yeah, that's it, I guess, for the general chit chat of where the podcast is going. I hope you enjoy it. Oh, and one additional thing, I think in terms of the release schedule, I'm going to try and do it fortnightly. I think trying to do an episode a week might be a bit too much for the initial launch, but we'll see how I get on. So I think fortnightly is something I'll try and stick to. This episode, I did all the 40k and heresy content from the reveal show. I would have liked to have also done all the fantasy and Blood Bowl stuff, but I just sort of ran out of time and I basically came to 2 hours as it was, and I just wanted to get the episode out. So those bits I might still record and put out as a little bonus. I don't think it's enough to be a whole episode in its own right, so I might invoke the concept of the Patreon transitional noise, which was always planned to be a sort of special Patreon-only episode for extra content. So if I do get time, I will record that and I'll probably put it on there just as a little thank you to the Patreon supporters. And it's also not like a main bulk of content that I'm, hiding from all you lot. So that is the general plan for the podcast going forwards. Yeah, just let me know what you think. And yeah, that's it. So we're now get on to the next part of the show. So in this section, we are talking about the Red Corsairs, the other kind of piratical Corsairs, the Elder Corsairs that we're going to cover slightly later on. So this is Huron Blackheart, who was first previewed in the Christmas Day reveals. So we saw him and then we were teased with the other members of his entourage. So we're going to go through him and the other miniatures that they've previewed for the Red Corsairs. I'm really excited about the Red Corsairs. I've always had a bit of a love affair with the idea of the Red Corsairs, of collecting them, of having renegade space marines. They're basically so much more exciting than regular chaos corrupted Space Marines, the idea that people have just defected from the Imperium and for other reasons, whatever they might be, and they're maybe not Chaos aligned or they're slightly Chaos tainted. In the case of the Red Corsairs, they're undivided, so they haven't aligned themselves with any one particular god. So their Chaos taint isn't quite as noticeable as some of the more traditional Chaos factions. These guys look very good, I'm going to say, off the bat. And again, talking about my love of them, I was a big reader of the Badab War. I collect Minotaurs as one of my Space Marine, or currently only Space Marine chapter, but these are very compelling models. The concept of having Red Corsairs. Yeah, Huron Blackheart's always been one of my favorite characters, at least in terms of the Chaos range. This is a real glow up. So we're going to have a look through the models. If you're listening along, you can actually follow us on YouTube, where we're going to have a video version of it, so you can see the models themselves. Here's the initial picture, which is showing you Huron and the entire Comrade collection that he has. There are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 extra miniatures in addition to Huron himself. And there's an interesting mix of Badab War stalwarts. So we've got Garyon the Corpse Master, who's the Lord Apothecary, and he was in the Astral Claws. We've got Qatar Garrix, who's the headsman and formerly of the Executioners, which feels quite fitting. And then we've got Garlon Soul Eater, who's a sorcerer and was part of the Mantis Warriors. They all fled with him into the Maelstrom at the end of the Badab War. Huron himself, which is also from the Astral Claws. So a nice motley crew to go alongside with him. These are going to, I guess, be like a kind of command squad retinue, very similar to Titus and the models that he came with. So let's look at each one individually. Let's start off with Huron, who is a phenomenal mini, though there's the caveat that a lot of people don't like his face. And I sort of understand it. It's very different from what he had before. He's been depicted in artwork, and quite recent artwork as well. And he just has much more of like a classic, generic, bald head. Yes, half of his face is missing, but it's got this just classic Space Marine stoic look to it, which I kind of liked. I liked that original look to him. This one is a little bit jarring. It is actually very similar to Felstius, I think his name is. So if we look here, the Lord of Contagion, Lord Felfius and the Tainted Cohort, which is now generic Blight Lord, Lord of Contagion. He's got a very smiley, happy-go-lucky face. It, I think, was quite wildly derided, but it has grown on me over time. So there's a lot of similarities there with Huron. Huron with his giant smile, really jarring initially, but actually in the few weeks since he's been out and previewed, I kind of like it. He's basically much more characterful now. He's a very distinct visual face, and not a by-the-numbers generic Space Marine. It would actually be really interesting to compare the head to the original Forge World mini that he had. So we've got the image of Huron, Luft Huron as he was called, from the old Forge World website as it once was. And you can see here that this head doesn't really look like the new one particularly. Again, it's just a by-the-numbers generic Space Marine. He could be anyone. He has a bit of hair. He has a tiny mouth in comparison to what he now has at the very least. The model's gorgeous though, but he's a sort of very nondescript Space Marine. So the new one has a lot more character, and I don't mind that. That's not a problem. One of my favorite things about the Red Corsairs as well, in relation to like the armor, is that they were always much more less chaosified. Yeah, they've got some spikes and they've got some embellishments and they've got the trim, but it's way more understated than most Chaos Legionnaires and Chaos Marines. And Huron's probably one of the more chaosified looking minis, but I think it's relatively toned down in comparison to a lot of the Chaos Lords that you do get. the old sort of wrestler style belts, which I'm normally not a huge fan of, but it is sort of iconically Chaos and Space Wolf. So he's got that. Abaddon's got it as well. He is very much like a mini Abaddon. I can see that. The little critter, I was a bit on the fence about when I first saw it, but then, it is part of his old model and artwork and lore. So it makes sense. And actually having it as part of the miniature and not a separate mini is really good. It basically makes it much more of a little diorama. His axe is cool. His sort of iron halo that he's got around him, which is sort of like a trophy rack, that looks really good. You can see the backpack is clearly a bit of a nod to old style armor as well. So overall, I would say a good mini. A little bit jarring with the head, but I think that's grown on me. Hopefully it will grow on you guys as well. And worst case scenario, there are plenty of other heads out there that have half the face missing that you could just do a head swap for. And size-wise, you would hope would at least be compatible and not too out of place. What you don't want to do is put a head on that's just too small. So that is Huron. Let's look at the next guy, which is Garyon the Corpse Master. And again, what strikes me about this is he looks mostly like a standard Marine. He is not chaos in any way. Yes, there's a tiny bit of like kind of classic chaos trim on his legs, but for the most part, like the top half, he just looks like a Space Marine in an older mark of armor, which is really cool. I love his little claws that are coming out of his backpack. They're not quite mechanendrites, but like little servo arms, and how one of them has a little servo skull on it. That is very cool. And just the general sense of what he's going on here. Although actually noticing that he does have a mechanendrite arm coming round his left-hand side, the right-hand side of the image, literally about to claw the nearly dearly departed Red Corsair mini that he stood on. It's not a tactical rock, it's a tactical corpse who's struggling to still survive. And then the rules that they explained in the live stream is I think he gains a CP when there's a unit within half strength nearby him, basically, because he's clearly harvesting the gene seed. And that really ties in with the general vibe of the Red Corsairs and when they were at the Astral Claws and the whole Badab War. The whole Badab War was Huron not wanting to pay the gene seed tithe to the Imperium because he thought they weren't doing a good job protecting the realm around the Maelstrom. And he thought he could do a better job. So he's like, I'm withholding it until I get support, at least from what I remember. So yeah, he's very cool. Next up is Gatar Garrix, again in sort of nice old style Mark armor. He's got a sort of skull helm, which gives him a slight chaplain vibe. And obviously the chaplains, at least in the Primaris, have the Judicia, who is like an executioner. So I don't know if that's like a deliberate synergy to have their own chaos version. But that is quite interesting. And then obviously Chaos have their own Executioner mini as well, which is separate from this. But I guess this is maybe the Red Corsairs specific Executioner mini. Covered in trophies, which is a little over the top, but it's very cool. Again, armor looks very Space Marine, not very chaosified. I think my one criticism of this model, maybe it's one of the eye sockets seems to be missing an eye, which is a bit jarring to look at, but does make it distinct and not just look like a chaplain mini. And also the haft of the axe is like sort of real traditional wood. It looks like that's a bit ramshackle and not the original shaft that the axe would have had. And I sort of get that. Like, that is also the vibe of Renegades. They are struggling. They don't have support in the same way that they have always traditionally, a Space Marine chapter would have it. They can't just go to the local Forge World and get a new axe. They are having to make do and mend, as they say. So this model's teasing that for sure. There are elements of that sort of ramshackle scavenging nature in these models, and that's the kind of story that I do like that they're telling here. And lastly, for the Marines, we've got Garlon Soul Eater, who is a sorcerer. Now, he's probably the most chaosified one of the lot. So I think this is maybe the model I like the least. Got a very traditional chaos backpack, lots of sort of bone embellishments on it. Very Thousand Suns-esque in terms of the helmet and the robes. There's something that's not quite as... It's not winning me over in quite the same way as the other minis are. And maybe that's just because it's a sorcerer or it's, nodding to the Thousand Suns. The combination of the Red Corsairs fist also appearing on the Chaos Star, kind of clever. I'm not sure I like it though. I don't know. I think there's just something slightly off with this mini that I can't quite tell. Maybe it's because half of him looks like he's in power armor and the other half is a robe for his lower half. And that's like a real juxtaposition. But I mean, you get that with a lot of sort of sorcerer marine minis. Yeah, overall it's okay. It's just not the best. Next up, we've got the first of the non-Space Marine miniatures, which is Captain Sargota, who is, I assume, the ship captain of whatever ship the Red Corsairs actually have. Does it actually say it down here? Oh, just shipmaster of a Red Corsairs fleet. Doesn't give a particular name to the ship. But in the live stream, they talked about how this sort of podium that she's on, she sort of floats in terms of boarding actions, and all the mechanendrites connects to the ship to take over the enemy ship, which is really cool. She's got some little sort of bird skulls embellishments on her. She's got a peg leg, which is suitably piratical. Yeah, it's great to see human elements in Space Marine forces. They did that with Titus. I have for a very long time been running the hashtag on Instagram, Codex Surf, which is basically trying to force as many humans into my Minotaur's army as possible. And often they're not actual playing pieces. Well, I just use them as tokens to represent wounds or maybe something else. But for the most part, they're meant to be wound tokens for the characters or for the unit. But it gives you that real John Blanche-esque style vibe that Space Marines just aren't there fighting on their own. They're also fighting alongside guys in robes, tech priests, the Adeptus, the priesthood, basically. Like, there's all these other surrounding logistical human forces allowing the Space Marines to do their job as well. And visually, I think that's much more fantastic. So this is a really cool, bold choice. And I'm here for it, basically. It's a cool model. And then last up, we've got two aliens. So we've got Tarlean, who is the bounty hunter. And then she's also got a dog with her as well. These are two really cool and interesting minis. And I remember when they were previewing these and they were just silhouettes, due to the arm that she's got here, a lot of people suspected that maybe it was like a Votan robot, like one of the jackals, but it wasn't. It was something completely different. And this is such like a mad and interesting design. It's great when 40k gets expanded to show these Xenos elements. And it's like, if you were to give us an entire unit of this that was not aligned to anyone and was effectively like in Age of Sigma, like a Regiments of Renown, which is effectively a unit that most factions could just take as a one-off. This is a fantastic idea. This is what I've always said about Tau and, Tau's, all these extra aliens that the Tau have like subsumed. It's a great way to explore these other alien races without having to do an entire new faction. And this is like a nice little addition. It's a great little tease and a way of expanding stuff out, which I love. So she's got like a kind of power fist type thing, which apparently she lost her normal arm when trying to tame the actual dog that she has here, which is called, I believe, let's just have a quick look, Bargessi, which is a vicious little dog. And apparently they can get much worse by the sounds of it, but this is a much smaller version than the sort of larger, more vicious versions than they can grow up to become. The slightly weird human raccoon-esque hands are great, and then the sort of the quadruple eyes, really unnerving, but in a great way. I mean, these models are all fantastically painted as well, but there's just so much interesting kind of character to them and sort of storytelling. The addition of aliens in Red Corsairs is I think, new from as far as I'm aware. I mean, I'm probably not that up to date in terms of what they've been up to post the Badab War. So, yeah, this is really interesting. It's a great direction that they've done for this unit. So if we just look back at the unit overall, I am super stoked about these. They're all pretty phenomenal minis. Yeah, the Sorcerer, maybe not as keen on, but it is pretty good overall. And I'm generally really tempted to get them. I think they'd be a phenomenal small force to get alongside the other miniatures that they've previewed for Red Corsairs. So let's get on with those. The Lord of the Maelstrom's Battle Force box containing some old miniatures with upgrade sprues and also some brand new miniatures. There's the Reeve Captain, which you can just about see here at the bottom. Then we've got the Red Corsair Raiders, which is a phenomenal new unit, which we'll look at in more detail shortly. We've got some Traitor Guardsmen, 10 of them at the back, Chaos Legionnaires, and 5 standard Chaos Space Marines in Terminator armor. And they've all got upgrade sprues, basically. So they're the old kits with new bits added on. So let's take a closer look at probably my most favorite piece of the Red Corsairs. I mean, Huron's still up there, but these are phenomenal because these are quintessentially how I see Chaos Space Marines, especially the Renegade Marines, rather than the sort of standard traitor Chaos Space Marines. Like, they're very unchaosified. They have very few spiky bits. They are basically a mixture of hobcobbled old armor. So in the guys that we first see, we've got some very punk hairdos, which is quite cool. There is the kind of quintessential chaos style backpack where the exhaust vents are like protruding out to the sides further. So they're still there. There's a lot of sort of fabric tabards and fur embellishments going on, but the actual marks of armor is much more closer to like 4, 5, I would say, a bit of 6 in some areas than some of the others. So yeah, they look really cool. Obviously, they've still got the effectively mini wrestling belts. They're not quite as egregious as Hurons or Abaddons, for example, but they've got that sort of nod to the direction of where they will go. What looks like the squad leader, the sergeant, he's got a power sword and a hand flamer. Then there's another guy with a chainsword and a bolt pistol. Next up, we've got what's been described as a guy looking like he's about to grab a lightsaber, but it's a telescopic sight for his rifle, although he actually looks like he's got a chainsword and a bolt pistol. Chainswords and bolt pistols seem to be the de facto. We do actually see a Mark 7 helmet, which is really good. I would like to see them lean more into the Mark 7 stuff because I think, I'm pretty sure the majority of the Space Marines around that time would have, and I say at that time, the Badab War, have a lot of Mark 7 stuff. Although Badab War did have an awful lot of different armor marks because that was when Forge World first actually introduced the concept of different marks of armor. And actually produced them in terms of, I think it was, 2 to 5 basically is what we, no, I guess it would have been 2 to 6. I'm pretty sure they did them all, and that was very much a precursor to the Horus Heresy ones. I could be completely wrong, but I'm pretty sure they did a lot of those in resin early days. So those guys look really cool. One of them's got very in sort of Primaris, the sniper squad, where you've got a cloak covering the backpack. Then we got 2 more guys, one with a melter gun and a sort of half helm, just showing like covering the rebreather that's a much more of a Legionnaire style helmet, because it looks a bit more chaosified. And that's, I think, Mark III backpacks we've got here. And then the other guy's got a chain axe and bolt pistol. So quite assault heavy. Apparently these have got 3 wounds each, so they're quite elite. I presume this is the same guy that we saw at the very beginning, because he looks very champion or squad leader-esque as well. And he's also got the bolt pistol and sword. Let's quickly skip back. Yeah, that's the same pose. So that's clearly you're getting 5 models, but they are multi-pose. So you'll get 2 lots of 5 with variant build options, because that's clearly the same guy with a helmet with a plume rather than the other guy having a bare head. He looks really cool, and I absolutely love this guy with the power fist. He looks phenomenal as well. So it's interesting that I assume he's not the sergeant, and that actually you're just going to get a guy with a power fist in the squad. Now, his head is very interesting because it is ultimately what probably people want Huron to have. Half of it's been blown away. He's a bit half Arnold Schwarzenegger, half Terminator. In that classic generic Space Marine, just stoic face, nondescript, no hair, bald. It's sort of what I imagine most people want Huron to be. And it's great that it comes in this kit. So if you did want to do a head swap, it's super easy. You could swap this head out, and there'll be plenty in the Raiders kit for you to just stick another helmeted head on. So that's a great option to see. And I just love that there's all these flat panels on the armor. There's a bit of trim here and there, but there's lots of space either for decals or just to make painting easy. A lot of the other kits a lot of kits nowadays are so complicated with detail, it makes painting a real nightmare. And, some of these, like the guy on the left, where you've got loads of fur cloak and loads of gubbins around his waist and groin area, like there seems to be a lot of elder weaponry in terms of there's like a dagger here, and then there's like a symbol and jewels hanging off. And that is also what Huron's got on him as well. So I'm not entirely sure the link between the Red Corsairs and Eldari, other than the fact that I guess they're just raiders and we'll probably come across them and just have beef with them. But beyond that, I'm not quite sure what the link would be in this regard. So it'd be interesting to see from a lore perspective why they've added on these little nods here and there. But maybe it's to potentially distinguish them from standard Chaos Marines. But these guys look great. Then we've got the last 2. One guy is chucking a smoke grenade by the looks of it, and he's actually got a bolt rifle, old school style. Awesome sort of black band makeup going across his face. And then the last guy's got a Mark 6 beaky helmet and a bolt gun as well. So it feels like you're going to have a mix of a couple of bolt guns. I guess if these are duplicated, you're going to have maybe 4. So let's have a quick look up here if we can see. There's definitely 1, 2 melter gun. Yeah, maybe it kind of looks like in a squad of 10, you're getting 2 bolt guns, a melter gun, and then a combination of pistols and close combat weapons, which is an odd mix for a squad. It will make it a pain to play just because you're rolling lots of different dice and doing different things. But I love the sort of versatility that this is implying, that they are, a raiding force. They've got lots of different weapons. So I think visually this feels very on brand for the Red Corsairs. So I think that's very cool. So overall, the Raiders, like 10 out of 10 in my mind, maybe 9 out of 10. These are really strong unit. This is what I want all Red Corsairs to look like, and it's a bit of a shame in a way that these are a special, unique unit that are very elite. So you can't make an entire army of them. You're going to have to fall back on those standard Chaos Legionnaires with their upgrade sprues. And before we get into them, let's look at the Reeve Captain. So he's quite cool. Maybe he's not as cool as Huron and his cohort, and he's not quite cool as the Raiders. So he's not bad. I'm certainly drawn more to the guy with the helmet on and the mace. and he seems to be holding something in his hand, versus the guy with the plasma pistol and power sword. Although I do like the hooked sword. That's very practical. He's also got a eye patch, so he's quite, pirate themed. So he looks cool, but I think the pose with the helmet on does look better, and that kind of sort of little trophy rack poking out of his backpack also just gives him a bit more stature, I think. Then we've got probably the weakest part of the box, at least, is the Chaos Legionnaires with the upgrade sprue to make them look like Red Corsairs. Now, when they did this with Night Lords, it looked phenomenal, and it was probably the best looking Chaos Legionnaire sort of generic warriors that we've ever seen. They looked phenomenal, and they're using the same base kit as this one. Yeah, it just doesn't look as cool. And I don't know if it's because the Night Lords had a better upgrade sprue or just their helmets are so iconic and the paint scheme sort of carries it along. To me, these are the least Red Corsairs things in the box. They look too chaosified for my personal taste. This isn't what I would want. I would want them to look more like Mark 7 and older Space Marines with a few chaos embellishments on them from time to time. But basically, from what I can gather, it's the shoulder pads, the heads, a lot more of the bare heads, and I think a couple of the weapon choices in terms of the style of the chainsword. And we can look at the actual upgrade sprue separately. So yeah, they're kind of okay, but it's not what I want. And I think what I would do if I was to do a Red Corsairs army, which I am really tempted to do, it would be to try and source some Horus Heresy miniatures for the older marks of armor and load them out in the same way as the Chaos Legionnaires, because you've got the restriction of WYSIWYG and trying to make them play like Chaos Legionnaires, even if stylistically they look a bit more like the Raiders. So I think that'd be the way to lean into it. Sadly, there's no Mark 7 Space Marines in like the current scale, with the exception of some of the Hero Rangers. So you could lean into that slightly if you had access to them. I think Mark 7 will come at some point, especially now the story is focusing on the scouring in terms of the Black Library books. I wouldn't be surprised if they do Mark 7 down the line, and then it would be a perfect opportunity to do Red Corsairs then. But using some of these isn't the end of the world. Maybe taking some of these and removing some of the spiky bits and some of the trim details, pairing some of the more chaosified elements. I think also swapping out some of the backpacks. I don't mind these chaos backpacks from time to time, but a whole unit of them just looks too much. I think they need to go back to some of the other things. Yeah, I would be potentially inclined, at the very least, to swap out some of the backpacks for some older marks, which I think would be quite easy to do. Then we got the Terminators. These kind of look all right. The new Terminator kit as Chaos Minis was pretty phenomenal. It just looked like a slightly better version than the original models that they were replacing. What I would do here is take the helmets and swap those out for ones without the tusks. Just go to the standard, current range of Primaris Terminator helmets and use those and see if how compatible they are, just to have a bit more of a classic helmet look. Probably get rid of the trophy racks on most of them, maybe with the exception of the squad leader. The lightning claws I really like on here being fingers. That's very cool. Yeah, the use of the fur pelts and the tabards, which are in the base kit, not the upgrade, because for these it is just a shoulder pad. That's all you get. It does work well and looks very similar to the Raiders, so that's not too bad. Yeah, I'd just be inclined. I'd almost be tempted to do the Primaris kits and do sort of 50-50 mix them in some way, but I think this would be the easiest way, is just doing this. And yeah, just minimizing some of those chaotic elements. Definitely get rid of that sword if I was going for the sword. I'm not a fan of that. Okay. I feel like I've cast my judgment on Terminators. Let's look at Traitor Guard. Traitor Guard is cool. I've always said it. Traitor Guard, being renegade militia, deserve their own codex. They should be in their own army in their own right. So this is the path of least resistance for Games Workshop, giving us an upgrade sprue, and I will talk about this in a bit more detail when we look at the upgrade sprue. It's a little bit minimum effort from them, which is a shame. But for Traitor Guard, specifically for the Red Corsairs, isn't too bad as a concept. From what I gather, it's mostly a paint scheme. But Traitor Guard's really cool. I'd love to see them flesh out the Guardsmen with more models, like a command squad, heavy weapons squad, all the classic stuff. But also in the Forge World range, they did the Ogryns or mutated Ogryns, I think they were, the Enforcers, which had like these sort of beast pack masters and things like that. So there's a lot more they could do with Traitor Guardsmen. So it's massively underrepresented in 40k from what they once were and what could be. So yeah, let's look at the upgrade pack, which also comes with some transfers, which allow you to do some vehicles. So yeah, we got 5 heads. I mean, there's nothing that really screams Red Corsair in terms of the head start, other than that they clearly have cool haircuts when they're not bald. And a lot of the work is actually the paint scheme with the little stripes going across the eyes, which you could really do with any Space Marine head. Like, you could use Space Marine heads rather than the Chaos ones. And maybe that's probably a good route to go if you did want to like convert some minis up. Just use Space Marines for the most part. You've then got 10 of the Red Corsairs shoulder pads, and then you've got 5 of the Terminators shoulder pads, which have the embellished, embossed detail of the fist on it for, the chapter marking. That's cool. I do sometimes like just using transfers over having to hand paint these. So, it's not the end of the world just having a plain shoulder pad. Then basically you've got 2 types of chain swords, which there's one that's like with a round tip that goes all over. That one's quite iconic, and I think you see a lot more in Space Wolves. I quite like that one. The other one where it's got an extra sort of sharp bolt attached to the end that's a bit more like a sort of spike, and less keen on that one. And then you've got some sort of generic trophy racks, again with Elder stuff. So you've got a Eldari or Drakari head, you've got some hands, you've got some gems that look very Eldari, you've got a nondescript skull, which could be anything, and what looks like a book. So they're kind of cool, having like they're sort of Bandalore style with bullets attached to them, that sort of nice little embellishment details that you can do. And the thing, my point I sort of teased out that I want to explain a bit more in detail here is it's a bit low effort in comparison to what you get with Space Wolves, Blood Angels, Dark Angels. These are all sub-factions of Space Marines. They have entire ranges to themselves where they use some generic Space Marine minis, but they've got characters, they've got squads, loads of unique squads, upgrade sprues, all sorts. And you have seen that with the big Chaos gods like Thousand Suns, Death Guard, Old Eaters, and this is a bit of a halfway house. I think this is them teasing the idea of these extra, slightly less popular Chaos factions, like the Night Lords getting just an upgrade sprue in Kill Team. This is just getting an upgrade sprue with a couple of extra, character-esque units and like one elite unit thrown in. It's slightly less than what World Eater's got, because World Eater's got Angron and like a handful of unique units and cultist units. But that was really minuscule. This is slightly less than that. I mean, I really do hope this is the first of a first wave, and maybe down the line in a year or two, we'll get another wave of Red Corsair minis and they can really flesh this line out, because I would like to see a bit more of a distinction between Chaos Marines and Renegade Marines, and there being a bit more of a distinction. I think in the lore that they have used some demon or like kind of possessed cultists and things like that. I can't exactly remember, but I like the fact that the Marines themselves haven't fallen to chaos and been corrupted, and they're not like demon possessed, or they're not brimming with mutations. The chaos elements are much more toned down, and that's the thing I like about chaos in a lot of the heresy range, is that they're just, for the most part, just slightly different looking Marines. And that is what I like about them here. I mean, these are basically, in summary, Chaos Marines for people who don't like Chaos Marine aesthetic. And that's why I love them. So, yes, you could argue it's a poor showing for Red Corsairs that they're basically getting, I guess, 3 units. One's a character unit, one's an elite unit, plus an upgrade sprue. That's not particularly great. But I assume, come next edition, they are just going to be rolled into the main core Chaos book. They're going to go alongside because that book is predominantly Chaos Undivided, much like the Black Legion. The Red Corsairs are like a slightly smaller, cooler kid version of the Black Legion. So I can imagine them being there rather than being in their own book. I would love them to be justifiably in their own book for sure, but they need more models. And I hopefully, if this sells well, I could see that happening down the line, maybe. So yeah, it'd be exciting to see where this goes. So next up is the Eldar Corsairs, which were a small subfaction of Eldari from a while ago that hasn't really been represented properly in rules. Most recently, we got a kill team addition to them, which was a unit of just Corsairs. They then joined the mainline Eldari faction in a similar way to how Harlequins are sort of just rolled into the main faction now, not their own distinct separate thing. Back in the day, Corsairs used to be fleshed out by Forge World, and they had their own model range that you could supplement with your main Eldari army. So they had characters in unique units. So we're finally seeing this in the mainline 40k world with Games Workshop. This is with the Eldritch Raiders Battle Force, which is going to be a box similar to the Red Corsair one, which I think was Lords of the Maelstrom. So we've got a new vehicle. We've got some new sort of jump units, the kill team unit that we've already seen before, and then Prince Uriel, although if you're Adam Troke, you're calling him Iriel, which I assume is the correct pronunciation because people at Games Workshop would know that. However, he's Uriel in my book, and that is where we're going to lie forevermore. So yeah, it talks about the Battle Force box contains Corsair Sky Reavers, which I think are these guys, the Mystical Void Dreamer, which is this character hiding up in that corner. Then we got 10 Corsair Void Scarred, which is the generic one, and also the brand new Viper kit, which is a dual kit. So this isn't actually a Viper, but you can build it as a Viper, which is a vehicle, which is exciting. Much like Corsairs, these are models that I've wanted to own for a very long time in terms of I love the idea of doing Corsairs is in Eldari Corsairs. If I was to ever do an Eldar army, it would have been Corsairs. And that was a time when I think you could still just about get some of those Forge World minis. And I do remember eyeing them up a long time ago. So there's a small part of my heart which does really want to have these models. Not as much as the Red Corsairs, though. That is where where the vibe I'm feeling at the moment is I'm leaning towards them. So yeah, Prince Uriel as a model, this is a really phenomenal sculpt. He's got a back banner. He's got a sort of asymmetrical design with one large shoulder pad. He's got a bear head with a top knot and sort of like a metal Phantom of the Opera style face mask going on, which I'm not actually sure about what that is. It kind of looks cool. He's carrying a spear. I really love the leg detail where on the kneecap you've got like a little head. Really reminds me of, I think it was Cities of Sigmar because it was basically dark elf like sea captain for dark elves, I believe, has a very similar get-up, which is very cool. And I like those little elements. He's also got what sort of looks like a sort of weird shield arm buckler on his left arm. And that giant pauldron shoulder pad looks very cool. Really nice mini. If we scroll down slightly, we can see some extra views of it. So I actually really like the helmeted version. It's giving me Avatar of Cain vibes slightly. Or
One of the Yanari guys, the Vizark, I think it is, has similar vibe to him. And that's a cool mini as well. That's really phenomenal because it's not quite classic Eldari. It's a slightly different spin on it, and I think that's what I like about the Corsairs as well. If we just have a look at the old original model, which I think was originally metal and then done in fine cast, you can see a lot of the similarities. I think he's actually stood on a bit of a Tyranid biform chimney there. Like there's some chitinous plates that he's on, because I think he has been famous for fighting Tyranids in the past. So there again, he's got his Phantom of the Opera mask on, so that is clearly a part of him. The twin back panners, and the spear. So I mean, that is a cool pose and a cool miniature as well. And they've just done a very similar thing where they've taken all of those elements and just given him a kind of more dynamic pose, but a lot of it is very similar. So that is cool to see. Moving on, we've got the Sky Reavers. So they are a jump pack elite shock troops armed with Corsair blades and multiple special weapons. So these are really interesting, and I'll show you what they also remind me of. So yeah, they've got the almost like bug style wings protruding out their backs. One of them's got like a sort of a sky hook, a chainsword, pistols and blades. Some of the others have got blasters. It's that classic problem with jump pack units where they've moved away from flight stands. So instead we've just got them on rock, always in a landing pose, and it gets a bit old quite quickly. And the fact that they're basically a foot off the ground doesn't really make them feel like they're flying in the air, which is always a bit of a downside. I would much rather they be like another inch or two off the ground, a bit more in the air, even if that means having a much larger piece of ruin or rock protruding from the ground, like a column or something. That's how I've always kit bashed my jump pack models to look like, custom making a base and pinning them. So if I was to ever have these, not that I will, I don't think, that is what I would do to them, just because that bit I think is slightly frustrating. There's some female heads. Yeah, I mean, some of the poses aren't wowing me, to be polite. And some of the heads are quite cool. Yeah, some of the poses are a little bit more dynamic, but again, yeah, I guess there's not what you can do with, I assume, 10 different models, or well, I assume it's going to be 5 duplicated with some alternate swaps. They're cool in concept. I don't think the implementation is completely nailing it. However, they basically are an evolution of the old Forge Rod minis, which I'll bring up here. These were the Forge Rod Corsairs, and you can see here that kind of bug wing jump pack protruding from the back. These guys, much larger rifles, and then there's like a heavy variant of them as well, which you can see here with really big heavy weapons. But again, these two protruding bug wings from the back forming a form of jump pack. Now, these really remind me, going back to Rogue Trader, there's a fantastic bit of artwork which we can load up. And you can see these 3 or 4 Eldari bugs in the air, and that is clearly where the original inspiration came from. So it was great to see a really old reference from Rogue Trader being picked up by Forge World and used there, and then that being again reused in the new models. So it's great to see this evolution from these kind of slightly mad concepts all the way back in Rogue Trader. And I don't believe these ones here from Rogue Trader ever really had models like that. I don't think the initial Eldar models had these kind of bug wings at all until the Forge Rod ones came out. I could be wrong. Again, it's a thing that maybe Dan would know, but Dan is sadly no longer with us. Not like that, but he's just not on the podcast. So it's great to see that kind of evolutionary narrative going through the model line. These new Corsairs being very similar all the way back to that Rogue Trader mini. So that's a nice little touch. We've then got the Karseth, which is a Voyage Dreamer who is a form of Psyker. Really sort of big bug helmets. Bugs is maybe a bit theme form. Looks quite quintessentially Eldari though. I'm sure you could just proxy this if you wanted it to be a regular sort of Psycho mini for Elder. So it's a cool mini. I like it. Really kind of dynamic pose with the way the robe is going up into the air. Stuff is nicely detailed. Overall, not really much else to say. It's a bit hard to tell what's going on with the left hand. I think it's just stretched out, but then there's all these ribbon bits taking out the side, which is sort of obscuring it from a silhouette point of view from the image. So getting to see a 360 of this would be really good, I reckon. And then last up, we've got the Viper and the Starfang. So here is the Viper version. So this is a dual kit. This is, from what I can recall, the first time we've had a classic vehicle. I know I misspeak. The Sentinel was a more recent one where we've had a classic redo of a really old sculpt. Because for the most part, while all through 8th edition onwards, we've had a slow rolling out of new models for every single faction. It's mostly been focused around the infantry and not vehicles, because I think the vehicles, for the most part, age quite well because you don't really see much in the way of crew on them, and they're just really nicely designed. The Sentinel was very diddy, and that has been completely upscaled. The Viper looked pretty good, but it had an open back where you could see the crew, and I think that was a thing that particularly dated this vehicle over some of the others. So I can see why it found an excuse to update that kit, and I'm sure down the line we will see things like the Graf Falcon and the other vehicles, even things like the Neiman Russ, the Rhino, the Land Raider, all get redone in due course, and maybe the next edition is where we will start to see that rolled out. Yeah, so if you look, you can see a really cool side view of the Viper kit where you can see that enclosed back cockpit. And then we also have, I think it's here, an image of the very original one, which is going on to 29 years, I believe. The Adam and Eddie was saying it was over 30 years, but I have a double check on the wiki, and it seems to be 29 years because it came out in 97. So we're 1 year shy of 30 years. But yeah, it's a long old kit. As you can see, there's this sort of the crew member with the gun at the back. It's sort of straddling a saddle type device. So that kind of open top feature, yeah, looks a little bit silly in modern day comparison. So streamlining it to look like more modern vehicles and being more of like an enclosed turret actually does it really good. And it does tie it in with the other vehicles that you have. Yeah, so it really does tie in visually with the Graf Falcon, which I just got up on the screen for those watching along. You can see that sort of bulbous turret, very similar to how they've done the new Viper. So that's a really nice touch, sort of tying it in more with the existing range. And they talk about how they made the jet engines at the back tie in with the existing vehicles as well, because obviously something that's designed 29, there's going to be some evolution from that kit to some of the later plastic kits like the Falcon and the Wave Serpent, and they're just sort of bringing these back in. Now, it does seem to have a very sort of spindly connection point between the two halves. That would be my only concern from a modelling point of view. Sounds like it might have a bit of wiggle room for pivoting around, so it can actually spin around, because I assume that's how it's meant to actually operate if it was in the real world. But yeah, it does give it a very fragile look to it, which is what Eldo should really be all about. And then we've got the Starfang, which is, I think, the Corsair specific build. It'll be interesting to see in the rules of that how it goes, but it sounds like with the Corsairs, they'll be joining the regular Eldari army anyway, but they do have some elements of Drakari weapons on them as well, because they are sort of crossing over across the factions. And it feels like it's got a bit more of an enclosed cockpit, and maybe it's a bit more, I'm trying to think of the name. It's not the Hurricane, but there is a version of the Hurricane that actually has guns pointing backwards. And it's yeah, it feels like that is elements of what that's being inspired to. So it's got a rear mounted cockpit with the guns facing backwards rather than forwards on the Viper. And then the cockpit is partially open, where the Viper is, I believe, fully enclosed, but with some slightly different detail. Yeah, similar wing design. The whole front section is the same. It's just that sort of cockpit design. I do actually wonder if it's the exact same piece that it's just literally rotated around, or if it's, for the most part, it's the same. But then there's a couple of extra elements on it just to give it a slightly different design. So that's really cool to see as well, like an expansion of the Eldari range with kit, and while the medium of a dual kit is always quite good, even if it is just a cost-saving exercise for Games Workshop, if you were to be really cynical about it, because that's why they do them. Then we've got the classic Corsairs, great kits filled with character, but it's a kit that we've seen before, so I don't really need to talk about that too much. But yeah, they look cool. And as a force, overall, is really nice. And if we just go back to that Battle Force box, you get a decent amount of models. It's not one that you'd probably want to buy multiple times. I mean, you could, but you'll be stuck with Uriel a couple of times, but then I'm sure you could easily sell him on. And then obviously you've got that psychic model as well, which you probably only want one of as well. But essentially it's a cheap way of buying a bunch of Corsairs. And again, we had the kill team initially, and that's all we've really had for Corsairs. So it's great to see them being expanded out, similar to the Red Corsairs. I would love these to be their own dedicated faction, to have more units that are unique to just them and more vehicles that are unique to just them. And maybe we will get down that route one day. I do feel like if they are going to do that, they're going to have to give a bit more love to the Harlequins and make them their own faction once more. Maybe that'll be something we see in the next edition. Who knows? But overall, yeah, these are it's a solid outing for both the Red Corsairs and the Eldari Corsairs.
So next up, we've got the campaign book, The Maelstrom Lair of the Tyrant. Much like 500 Worlds, it's in a slipcase featuring full components. The thing that actually puzzles me with this is actually when they were talking about 500 Worlds, I was assuming, much like Arcs of Omen was called Arcs of Omen, and it was a series of books all about the Arcs of Omen, I was expecting all of these books for the end of 10th edition to all be 500 Worlds, something. The first one was 500 Worlds Titus. I was expecting this one to be, let's say, 500 Worlds, Lair of a Tyrant, but it's not. It feels like these are completely separate engagements around the galaxy. They're not actually tied together in any way, which will be really interesting to see the future of what these other books will be, depending on how many we see. I think Arcs of Omen was 6 in the end. It might have been 5. And I think one of the downsides of Arcs of Omen is it felt like a real mishmash of different stories based on what models they wanted to release, and it was a little bit difficult to try and tie them all together. You had one that was all about orcs and Tau, and that one really felt completely out of place in comparison to the rest of the story. I guess you could argue Angron and the lion, that sort of showdown made complete sense, but some other elements were a little bit on the weak side, although overall I think the story was pretty good. So yeah, this one isn't doing this at all. This is not 500 Worlds. It's not continuation of 500 Worlds. Maybe one of the other books will go back to 500 Worlds, and what we'll see is 500 Worlds Titus is a part 1, and then there'll be a 500 Worlds something else, and that will be the part 2 to that campaign, which does have some previous, pre-established history with Games Workshop doing that. I think back in 7th edition you had a lot of campaign books that were done as tours. So there was like a first book and a second book, and you could buy them, I think, in a slipcase to combine them together. There was, I wouldn't say it was called Shield of Baal, but there was definitely all Leviathan, and it was basically Tyranids versus Blood Angels with a bit of Necrons in there. There was Space Wolves and Thousand Suns. And then there was some generic chaos ones, and I think also orcs and space wolves. Dan would know, but Dan is not here to help me out, so I'm having to fluff this. Anyway, the Maelstrom, Lord of a Tyrant, completely different setting, kind of makes things a lot easier than trying to tie it in with 500 worlds. This one is both the Red Corsairs and the Eldritch Raiders, I think they're called, which is basically the Corsairs in terms of Eldari Corsairs. Comes with 3 books. You've got the generic Lair of a Tyrant, which I presume is going to be the lore book. You've got the Raid and Ruin is the campaign book. Then you've got Crucible of Champion, which is specifically how to create your own custom characters as part of a campaign. And then you've got Lair of the Tyrant Detachments, which I think is going to be the Corsairs rules and data sheets. Let's have a quick look and see what it says. So there's an extensive background lore book covering the most notorious figures, Huron and Prince Uriel, about Orc freebooters, Chaos War bands hidden within the Maelstrom. The Raid and Ruin book contains rules for the new campaign. Okay, so that's the campaign book. And you have notoriety points to earn titles to prove themselves as being the best captive. You get 12 missions with options for 3 and 4 player engagements. 3 and 4 player missions, phenomenal, great addition to see. And there hasn't been any that I can think of so far in 10th edition, other than maybe the odd, like maybe in the Crusade rules, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. Yeah, Raid and Ruin, that is the campaign book. Crucible of Champions, they talk about here just briefly, make amazing characters of your own creation. So they talk about a rogue trader with 2 Inferno pistols, a Ravenwing librarian on a bike, Astra Militarum officer in a Sentinel, and, a psychic Tyranid artillery beast in a grot with big ideas. So I think they did similar things in 8th edition. It's been a while since they've done these kind of cool concepts of just building your own characters, which is great, especially when it's tied in with a campaign. So it's not impacting match play tournaments in any way. But for those that want just to have fun games, they can totally do it. And I imagine you could probably use the Crucible of Champions book without actually doing a campaign. If you want to just do some standalone games with your mates, just use these rules as a bolt-on. And I think that is the way to go. Now, you could say that we're probably going to get these rules for 4 or 5 months tops before a new edition comes out. And then will these rules still be compatible? Possibly not, which will be a real shame. And that's something to bear in mind with any of these books, is that there is potentially a limited lifespan on the rules. Potentially the campaigns themselves will still be valid because missions are relatively easy to translate over from one edition to the next, because for the most part, the way you score a mission is very mission specific and not edition specific. So there's, and you get your lore books as well. So yes, two of these books, the Detachments and the Crucible of Champions, might not be at all compatible with the new edition, which will be a shame if that's the case, but that is something to be aware of when buying them. Raid and Ruin, being the campaign book, and the generic Lair of a Tyrant, which will be the lore, will still be valid. So 2 out of 4. Is that value for money? That is for you to decide. I've been burnt quite a few times in those regards, but I will be picking this up because I particularly want it for the lore. It'll be cool to see what the rules are to give me some guidance on if I do create a Red Corsairs army, but I will have to go into building a Red Corsairs army knowing that by the time I've even built anything, it'll probably be the next edition, because it takes me that long to do stuff. So that is something to worth bearing in mind. Then we've also got some Maelstrom battalions, which is featuring some extra Xenos races. So these are effectively combat patrol boxes. You've got the Drakari coming in with some witches, Reaver jet bikes, some Hellions, and 2 Venoms. And that's not Leneth. Is it? No. It's just... Succubus. That's it. Just looks a bit like him. Yeah, I mean, I'm not really going to say anything about these. And then you've got the Votan with the Mimnir Strategist, which, I couldn't name for the life of me on the end of the year quiz, which we put out at the beginning of the month. You get the Herkin Pioneers,
Yeah. And, the Steeljacks. Interesting mix of robots and the bikes. The bikes are not my favorite. So again, if they had not included those, but is there any more robots they could have done? I guess it would have been just a regular unit because they include them as well. Yeah. I think if I could have lent more into just robots, this would have been visually more interesting. But, I think they're just trying to do a mixed bag of stuff. So, yeah, those two are available. I don't care about them personally. If you are a collector of those two, maybe you would be. And I guess you could, in a way, theme it to the campaign, but I wouldn't be too hung up on it personally. So now we're on to the last of the dedicated 40K section of the reveal show. And this preview, this little tease is saying it's for the Eye of Terror, and it's clearly the Iron Warriors. Now, it's probably worth noting that just before the reveal show came out, there was an presumed leaked image of Perturabo as this demon lord, but I think it's been roundly denounced as AI. I think at the very least, the photo composition is AI just because it's got that general look. The model itself does look pretty convincing. Does it look great? Probably not personally, as what a demon Primarch could be. Would Games Workshop do a better design? Yes. Does it look like quite a good sculpt, especially if it was AI? Yeah, it's okay. There are some telltale signs that make me think it's not legit. One, you can't see a base at all, and even on most of Games Workshop artwork, the base is still quite visible on it. Two, you've got a very tiny hammer. It just feels like if he was to have a hammer, it would be a lot bigger. And then also you've got, the little arrows that appear on the trim. So on one side, it's definitely an arrow, but then on the other leg, it's just kind of a straight line that doesn't really go anywhere. And then likewise, those sorts of arrow details elsewhere on the body are just sort of a bit all over the place. But the elements of these big exhausts on the back, this big claw, this big hammer, are those bits correct? Could someone have maybe seen the image, ran it through an AI, and this is what they got? So it's not a complete copy, but it's a fake in some way. Yeah, I mean, maybe. And then here we've got the actual Games Workshop reveals, and it makes me wonder if this was always meant to be part of the reveal show, or if this is a deliberate reaction to that Perturabo presumed leak that is, I think most people would say, is AI image. And Games Workshop is very good at reacting to stuff out there. So it does make me wonder if this was done purely because of that leak. It might just be a coincidence. It might be someone generated that image of a fake Perturabo because the general rumor consensus is that there's some Iron Warrior stuff coming out down the line. So that person is sort of playing into the rumors that are swirling around at the moment. So yeah, the first image is clearly like some kind of servo arm with a kind of a wrench claw with hazard stripes. The second image is clearly another kind of sort of servo arm weapon. Looks like it's going to be a flamer of some kind. And these both look like they're shoulder mounted. So could be on a Perturabo, could be on a demon engine of some kind or demon prince. I mean, who honestly knows? There is a hammer that looks much bigger and much more Games Workshop. So maybe these are images of Perturabo. If it was, it just feels a bit odd that Perturabo wouldn't have been the Christmas Day reveal. Huron is big, but a Primarch is bigger. Maybe they've not done it because that's what they've been doing for the last few years and they wanted to mix things up a little bit. I don't know. And then for the last few bits is we've got an Iron Warriors shoulder pad, and then we've got these large exhausts, which do make me wonder if this is a Chaos demon engine of some kind, like a Hell Brute. Let me go and do some resets quickly, and then we can come back to that one. There's a giant claw, which does feel like, if you look at the background detail, does feel like it's on the Soul Grinder. Again, another kind of claw arm. Is it the same one and it's just open? No, it does look slightly differently. This looks like a bit more organic, so this has more of a Hellbrute vibe to me. And then there's a foot. This looks quite small, so this could be just like an Iron Hands captain, potentially Perturabo, but I sort of doubt that one. And then we're back to the beginning. They do tease that this is specifically which miniatures do these belong to, so it's not all one miniature. I think there's definitely, at the very least, an Iron Warriors captain or leader model of some kind. Could be a named character that's just not Perturabo. Could be one of these is Perturabo. And then I think some of them are a bunch of demon engines. So if we look at the Mauler Fiend and Forge Fiend designs, you can see that they do have these kind of fists for mechadendrites, but most importantly, these kind of exhausts coming from the back that you can see here. So, and look at this lovely hazard stripe fist as well. So I could very much see some of this kind of backpack exhaust bit definitely being part of the Mauler Fiend. Then maybe one of these fists belongs to a Mauler Fiend as well. That I'm still convinced is a Soul Grinder. So quickly looking at the Hellbrute miniatures, I'm just scrolling through, and actually maybe these aren't anything to do with it. There is a fist version here, and they do have that kind of mixture of flesh and armor combined. So it's certainly a possibility, but it doesn't feel like it quite lines up in the same way that the Mauler Fiend does, but then maybe they're completely redesigning it. So maybe they're being a bit more intricate with their detail, because these claws that they've previewed are a lot more finicky and yeah. So this claw style does remind me a lot more of Mastor's style. So maybe that's just the direction they're going in, and they're not really taking many notes on the old Hellbrute, if this is at all a Hellbrute preview. Then my one last pick is there's a giant claw and what looks like some legs in the background with some hazard stripe armor. Now this is, I think it's the Defiler. So I think this is a new Defiler claw that we can see, and you can see on the old kit, they've got these like two large claws and then this big armored panel encasing it. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Claws are much more in keeping with Vastor. They've got a bit more of an organic look to it than a sort of an industrial kind of cutters that we've had previously. So I think what we're seeing is some Iron Warrior specific miniatures and then some generic Chaos miniatures painted up as Iron Warriors. And as I sort of talked about earlier with the Eldari stuff, I wouldn't be surprised if down the line we do see all the vehicles being redone. And I think I even said in the last episode with Dan, Chaos vehicles are hideously outdated. Like, they are really dated in comparison to the Space Marines or the Eldari, or even like some of the Orc stuff. So yeah, to see new Hellbrutes, to see new Defilers, new Mauler Fiends and Forge Fiends would be great. So that's it for the Decay reveals. Let's move on to the Heresy stuff. So we're now on to the Horus Heresy reveals, which includes the Legio Custodes coming to 30k in plastic for the first time ever. Obviously, these models already exist in 40k and were in plastic back then. And potentially what will be quite interesting to see is, will they keep any of those 40k minis or just get rid of them? So let's have a look at the miniatures and have a bit of a deep dive, because I think to an extent they've been quite controversial and there's some interesting things to discuss about them. So we've got the Legio Custodes Battle Group box, which is how these models are first being released. 15 models,
You get 10 of the standard Custodian Guard and their alternate poses. So you can have the Guardian Spear or the Sentinel Blade and Shields. And they all come with the Misericordias, which are their small daggers. You've got the Captain. We've got one of the Dreadnought variant, and then we got one of the Grav tanks. I can make a guess at it being the Palladus, but I don't actually know, so I have to double check that. Let's take a look at the minis. First thing to note is they're sort of a bit slimmer. I think it's mostly because they're taller rather than thinner, but it then gives them a much more leaner proportion, a bit like what we saw with Cataphracti Terminators in Heresy. They have really big helmets, and I actually like that. I love the giant plumes. I love the over-the-top helmet sizes. I know it's not going to be for everyone, but it really does remind me of the old John Blanche artwork when he did some initial concept work for them, going back many years. You can see here with the really tall helmets, which you just didn't quite get in the current 40k version. Noting here that they've got some kind of red skirt robe things going on and sort of leather boots. So it's not like they've done one for one copy of his old artwork, but I feel like they've taken some inspiration from it. The first miniature, it's got the Vexilla, which is the banner. That looks very similar to the style of the 40k version. They've got some really nice details. The one criticism I personally have with them is I think the legs are a bit too bare. The legs do look like Stormcast, and I can't remember who it was, but I saw someone on Facebook talk about this where they had photoshopped the legs from the 40k version, which has the eagle detail on the sort of shin area, and they put that over the top of these ones, and it did just look a lot better. So if we look quickly at one of the current ones, you can see you've got the Aquila symbol on it. And what's interesting here is actually that knee pad design blends into the shin. It's like all one piece, whereas this feels like they're two separate pieces, much like the Stormcast. Reiterating how I am invested in this army to an extent, much like with the Corsairs. The Custodes range has always appealed to me on a level, but I've built a Thunder Warrior army using Custodes rules. Sometimes I've used some Custodes heads, but I've obviously been inspired by like the weapons like the Guardian Spear and the swords and the shield to try and do a very WYSIWYG style army. So while visually it looks like Thunder Warriors, they still play as Custodes, so the weapon options are similar. Although sometimes I've sort of done inspired by style of design. And as part of that, one of the base units is the legs being part of the Stormcast Eternals. So that's why I can see the comparison between my models and these new Custodes having Stormcast legs. I don't hate it. It's just a very noticeable, very plain bit of armor where everything else on these new Custodes are being adorned with detail. And it might be that was a limitation on the kit or the sprue because you can't have undercuts. So maybe if the legs are particularly one piece, they couldn't have too much detail on there. Or visually, they just wanted to go in a different direction from the 40k versions. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it'll be interesting to see if the 40k ones will stick around as their own distinct identity. Because the Heresy ones, like in this article, they do repeatedly say, yes, you can use it for 40k. Heresy, Custodes, and Knights are the only range that still exists with rules in both 40k and 50k. It's, for whatever reason, it's their niche that they're allowing. Whereas everything else, like the Leviathan, the Contemptors for Space Marines, a load of units, loads of models have all gone to Legends. I think in part because Knights and Custodes in 40k sell extremely well, but they also have a very limited model range. And supplementing that with the Forge World Heresy stuff, they know is a money winner. So I can see these things for that pure financial reason, despite madly every other reason they've gone, well, no, like Contemptors sold extremely well for Space Marines, but for whatever reason they said no, not for that, but yes to this for having rules still in 40k.
So that's an interesting one. Anyway, let's move on with looking at some more models. The second set that we see, just more Guardians looking cool. Then there's one who, because there is no like leader of the squad because they're all independent, but there's one that's got a crest that's sort of like a mohawk. But I think in one picture that I saw, maybe it was in the video, it basically isn't actually attached to his head, maybe, or it's a plate that is, but there's a much bigger bit from the back. So I don't know if it's a bit like the Votan crests where it's not actually attached to their head. It's more attached to the piece of armor behind them. I guess we won't know until we get a proper look at the kits. But my initial instinct is these jumbo mohawks they almost look like how I imagine some of my Thunder Warriors do. But I actually don't like this for the Custodes. The giant mohawk looks wrong. I'm not a fan of it personally. It's also worth noting, probably at this stage, is the other big controversy, and that is the lack of trigger on the Guardian Spear that people have pointed out that did exist on the original kit, but doesn't seem to on the new one. So if we look at this 40k model of a custodian with a spear, you can see his hand is just on a trigger, which is sort of like halfway down. But it's also worth noting that their spear isn't just like a whole shaft. It's almost like it's like a bit of a rifle, like the mid part of a rifle. So it feels a bit more chunky than just a spear, unlike the DK versions, which are very much like a spear. I've seen people notice that there's like a midsection where there's like a join, and people have been speculating that maybe this is some kind of twist mechanic for activating the bolter. Other people have pointed out there looks like where the power point is, there's essentially like a button there. And then others have been saying that, the Custodes are so high tech, it could be like neural links from their helmets, and they can just, with the power of their mind, fire the gun, which feels particularly in keeping to me. But it goes to show that people do obsess about these little details on models. And, passionately, people want to know the reasons behind things, why there are law changes, what is going on between the realism of the design of a model as well. So that is important to note and see. It's the sort of thing where Games Workshop occasionally on Warhammer Community will do an article where they might go into explaining some of these things. Actually, when I was subscribing to White Dwarf, they were pretty good and did those things as well. And that was one of the more interesting aspects of White Dwarf, is when they have like designer commentary about designs, because it's these little things that we want to know, and that is where they talk about them basically. And Games Workshop did go through a phase maybe like 5 years ago where they would put out like designer interviews on Warcom, where the designers would chat through the designs, like why they made particular changes and things like that. And this would be a great example for that. So yeah, I would love them to do things like that more on Warhammer Community. So we've now got the Sentinels with their blades and shields. Like the shields are really nicely detailed. The swords look phenomenal. And actually, it was only until like last week when I realized that the Sentinel blades, like the hilt is actually the bolter. The hilt is the ammo clips basically, and then the gun barrel starts at the very bottom of the shaft of the sword blade. Like I never noticed that before on the old 40k ones. If we just go to one of the 40k designs, they do actually exist there. Like you can just about see it, but they're so much more squarer, and you can see that where normally the power line goes for the sword, the powered element, that's sort of the groove in which the bolt fires down, and that the power piece is actually to the side, to the left and right on the old one. And then in the new one, slightly confusingly. You've still got that groove for where the bullet goes, but that is also where the powered wired piece also goes. So that is slightly confusing and feels inaccurate, especially when, the gun itself is actually quite recessed and doesn't look completely realistic. Personally, I would be inclined to cut out that little powered line. Realistically, that should be almost like recessed one level down, so it wouldn't be blocking the bullet as it fires down that little groove. But overall, despite that nitpick, the swords look very cool, the hilt looks amazing, and the gun feels much more visibly noticeable. There's another Vexilla design that's a bit smaller with a much more tinier one-headed eagle on top, which looks very cool. Again, they've got the crested helmet bear head, which I don't like. And then we've got a couple more bareheaded options. There's a guy with a full head of hair, which I don't particularly like. And that's just generally, I think Custodes should have bald heads or mohawks, but that is just me. Then we've got some of the grav tanks. So we start off with the Calidus Annihilator grav tank, which I believe is the one in the Battle Force box set. I haven't actually double checked, but I assume these are pretty much one for one when it comes to the old resin kits with these new plastic ones. I think when it comes to vehicles in Heresy, they've done a really good job at sort of transposing the old designs to new and being really faithful to them. So I wouldn't be too surprised if these are exactly the same. And yeah, they're really cool minis. I love the sort of the two like large barrels going down both sides of the tank, which is where all the grav plates are. And then the inner bit is the main hull of the tank. So that looks very cool. Then we've got the Contemptor Dreadnought. There's two designs, one with the spear and a fist with some bolters, and similar to the actual Custodian guards, you've got blades and then you've got a sword and shield variant. There's clearly a few extra bits of detail that they've added on here in terms of like embellishments on the torso pieces. I kind of think when it comes to the shield version, the shield is just a tiny bit too small and would look a bit cooler if it's a bit bigger. And then with the blade, this time it's not a bolter, it's like a flamer. So that you've got like this little furnace cowling detail at the bottom of the hilt rather than a bolter like on the regular guys. But the dreadnoughts are cool. It sounds like they're really posable. So this is just phenomenal. Hopefully also they'd be a bit more cheaper than the old resin kits as well, because while Heresy in plastic is cheaper than the old resin stuff, it's still quite expensive, but it's not as bad as it used to be. So the fact that Custodes with the cool new toys will be a lot more accessible from a financial point of view is great. It feels like these are going to be really detailed kits, so they might be difficult to build, but the sort of the cost factor, the accessibility of in terms of they're less likely to be out of stock all the time like the old resin kits were, and sort of like the modularity and posability of these kits is going to be huge. Then we get on to the Shield Captain, which has some really phenomenal detail, like the sword and shield look fantastic. Again, the tall crest at the top looks awesome. And then I really love the detail of the embossed writing on the back, on the inside of the shield, because obviously it's going to be listing the Shield Captain's deeds down there. That's like a really nice touch. It does come with a bare head option, which is the first time we see a female custody, which is it's good that they finally done it, because they made the retcon ages ago, and I feel like this would have been better off doing alongside that rather than drip feeding us the bits around female custodies. But maybe they feel like that's the better way of managing it. In terms of the shield, like the design at the front for the Shield Captain looks really good. Like that's super detailed. And if you go up to the original design of the shields, yeah, you can see that there's like night and day difference. Like the regular ones are cool, but the Shield Captain has a very good shield, as they should, really, being the Shield Captain. Then we've got the Ventari, which I think
are sadly the weaker elements of the Custodes in plastic. So these were always a very unique Forge World unit. The original Custodian Guards were just the same plastic ones that we had in UK, but these were a unique resin kit. They've got two build options. One is with the spears, and the other is with the pistol and buckler. They're jump pack items. They've got these brilliant wing designs. The wing design actually is different, but much like what we had with the Corsairs, the Eldari Corsairs, is they're basically just on rocks. They're like a foot off the ground on a tactical rock, and it really lets the models down. I think you're losing that sort of imposing sense of jumping around and flying in the air, which you got with the original models. So let's just have a look at these. I mean, I don't mind the wing designs. I think that's quite cool. It's a very different, unique. I think it's a different shape from the original ones. But the fact that they're so low to the ground is really disappointing. I would like them to be higher up the ground. Maybe flight stands aren't the best, but here's the thing. If you really wanted to, you could just cut their foot off from the tactical rock and then just with a small bit of wire, like you need something quite strong, have a rod going up a few inches and attach it from that rock piece to the foot, and then paint that black. And if it's small enough, it doesn't matter that it's technically visible. The black sort of tricks the eye into thinking it's not there, and that often looks better than like an acrylic plastic rod with an air bubble in, which is what you get in a lot of the normal kind of classic jump pack minis. So if we look at the original Forge World minis, which are still available from Games Workshop, you can see the vents at the top of the jump packs are much thinner and sleeker and don't really jump out in size. And I really like that aspect of it. The armor on the legs is actually much more kind of cloth based. And I think if I remember rightly, the armor that they have and the armor that the guys that ride the jet bikes have has a distinct name, and the save isn't actually as good, or it's the number of wounds is different in Heresy. Lore wise, their armor isn't as good as standard Custodes armor because it needs to be lighter because they're on the bikes and because they're on jump packs. So there is a distinct difference here, which I don't think we get in the new version. So that is an interesting change. But you can see that the acrylic rod does kind of work here. It feels much more like they're jumping in the air and they're sort of floating or landing at least. Yeah, I think there's something to them being higher up in the air than being, a foot off the ground on a tactical rock. Some of the designs of this original ones, I think, is slightly better than the new ones here. So it's interesting going back to the new ones. You can see that the top calf part of their legs actually isn't armored, but the lower part is, and likewise their arms have more leather gauntlets than armor. So yeah, they've definitely kept some of those elements. The wings look a lot bigger, and the jet's sort of engine portion of the wings is a lot bigger. I guess it's worth noting that in terms of the Forge World units, this was a Forge World specific one. Obviously, all the vehicles and Contemptor Dreadnoughts also were Forge World, but there's more that we haven't seen yet that are. So there's the Agamastus Custodians, which were the Heresy-specific jet bikes. There was the Aquilian Custodians, which was the Heresy-specific Terminators, which are very different from the Games Workshop Terminators. And the Games Workshop Terminators were always much better because they never really bothered to update the points on their K1s to represent the fact that their rules just aren't as good. You had obviously the Ares and Orion gunships as well, so they're still to come at some point, we can only assume. And then there was the Sagittarian Custodes, which are the ones with the guns. They're like bolters and some experimental like beam weapon as well. So we haven't seen those yet either. And then lastly, we haven't seen any of the Sisters of Silence. So they haven't been touched here yet. So hopefully there'll be another wave where we see the remaining Forge World models
be redone, but also we see more Sisters of Silence. And I think that is a bit of a shame that they haven't done that here, but it would be great to see them come out at some point in due course, which I'm sure they will. So then we've got some more of the Grav Tanks. This is the Calidus one, which is the go-to tournament player one, I believe, for 40k, because it's just got a lot of punch and it does a lot of things that Custodes can't do on their own. And then lastly, we've got the Coronis Grav Carrier, which is a pretty big vehicle. And then at the very end, they mention that the data sheets for 40k are going to be updated. I don't know if that's to just bring them in line with what the weapon options are for these models, or if there's another reason behind it. I suspect, yeah, it's just that there might be a few different options here that you don't get in the 40k one. Whether they're going to make them both compatible at the same time, or they're just going to switch everything over to these new ones, that'd be quite interesting to see. And then I guess the sort of elephant in the room that I haven't really addressed so far is the female Custodes. And then Games Workshop, shortly after, I think it was a day or two afterwards, put out an article talking about it, and talking about Custodes are now being female. If we go back to, I think it was a year or so ago now when they first announced this, there was a lot of community backlash about it. There was a Warhammer Plus animation which featured the female Custodes, and that was quite cool. It was a good video. My take, between me and Dan, if I remember rightly, Dan didn't care too much, although it's annoying when they do retcon the lore. Mine was that it was a shame because actually I liked the dichotomy between having the female Sisters of Silence and male Custodes, and that as a sort of unit, as a fighting force with both men and women, but with their own separate roles, I thought was really interesting. You know, you've got Space Marines that are men, and then you've got Adeptus Sororitas, which are just women. And I thought Custodes was a good, or Talons of the Emperor, should I say, are a good mix where you have both distinct male and female forces. Now, actually, by making Custodes a mixture of male and female, they've also done a similar thing. It's sort of like the diversity of choice in terms of power armored models. So Space Marines are men, Sisters of Battle are women, and Custodes can be men or women, but then you also have Sisters of Silence that are just women, which fight alongside them. So it's still achieving a sort of diversity of choice, which I don't think is a bad thing. Let's see what they say. So they talk about, is this new? And they sort of say no, but all the models that we've seen up until now just look male, or the ones without helmets have always been male. It's worth noting that I guess a lot of the talk originally was in the lore. They talk about them being the sons of the noble houses, and they always refer to them as like sort of male pronouns, basically. So it isn't quite accurate to say like, well, they've always been ambiguous. Like, it hasn't been, but they're making room to sort of retroactively spin it. And it's not too bad the way they've gone about it. Having this article would have been better to have done it when they first made the change, like over a year ago, rather than the tweet where they said, well, actually, they've always been female, you just didn't realize, which I think was a bit of a rage bait post for a lot of people. So has it been the best rollout? Probably not. And I think, to be fair, a lot of fans are mostly concerned about whether this means, will we ever see female Space Marines? And I think a lot of people don't. And I feel like that's a valid thing to want to maintain the lore, regardless of the original intentions. Apparently, there were some female Space Marines or power armored models which were females back in Rogue Trader era, and they didn't sell. And then since then, they just pivoted to male Space Marines, and then they kind of canonically made that, fact with the lore reasons. Does that mean if they want to make female Space Marines, they should, just because they technically could, because it's a business model? I don't think they should. I think, you've made your bed and you've created this law reason to justify why they're only male. So going back on it many years later is a bit disrespectful to the world building that you've done up until this point. Is it possible in a way to say, well, similar with Primaris Marines, well, going forwards, they could potentially be? That is something they could do. But interestingly, Primaris Marines had huge backlash when they first came because people didn't like the law justification. And then if you look at it now, they've kind of undone the concept of Primaris Marines. They've kind of just gone, yeah, they're all Primaris now, but so we don't refer to them as Primaris, and they're just all Space Marines. And they actually now start using a mix of armor. So I think the Primaris retcon or law change hasn't really proven to be that successful because it feels like they've slowly backtracked on it over the years by making it disappear into the very ether of it's just something that Cool did. What's interesting, I guess, is when it comes to Space Marines and Custodes, very, myself included, I always assumed it was a similar process. I always viewed Custodes as a much more refined genetic engineering process, but similar to Space Marines. Space Marines is the mass-produced Ford car version in comparison to a sort of bespoke Ferrari or something like that. So I always assumed there were similar techniques in terms of how they were being gene created. And that gives you the scope to just sort of assume that all Custodes were male, even if that is maybe not their intention. I do sort of think the best way Games Workshop could have done this is when they first brought them back into 40k in 7th edition, I think it was. They should have just made the references to them being female back then, rather than giving us over 10 years of saying they're male and then going back on that. So that's just, there might be an internal politicking, internal reasons why they didn't want to do it then. I've heard people say that some people in Games Workshop really did want to push them to be female, and then other people not wanting to do that because there were no models that were female. And here they talk about them potentially coming from the sons of Terran houses, and they talk about the patriarchal houses, and yeah, that was a thing, and they did it to reinforce loyalty to the emperor. But they also said noble daughters could have been taken, and other methods of recruitment that were far more secretive. And yeah, this is quite a good way of trying to explain it. And then up here, when they do talk about the genetic alchemy for the process of Space Marines, is yes, it might feel like they're quite similar to Space Marines. They're actually not, and it's much more akin to, space magic, because it is so mysterious in terms of how they are created. Is worth noting that, as far as I'm aware, that Custodes don't have a gene seed. And actually, that is probably the biggest distinction between Space Marines and Custodes, is to say, actually, yeah, the gene seed is effectively analogous to needing them to be men, whereas Custodes don't need gene seed. That's why they could be both men and female. Now we get to some of the female heads. Personally, I'm not a fan of the ones with the long hair, because, like I said before, with the guy with a lot of hair or the guy with the mohawk, it just doesn't feel right for Custodes. I'm a bit like, if you want to make them female, cool, but just give them all bald, shaved heads. I'm pretty sure the one in the Warhammer Plus animation is also bald as well, or has very short hair. Let's quickly look it up. Yes, so it turns out I was completely wrong. She does have hair, but it looks relatively short, or at least it's pinned back sort of within the armor. It's not like we have on these miniatures where it's almost like a huge top knot with loads of hair. And I guess that is almost like the downside of female Space Marines, is other than them having long hair, how are you really distinguishing them from being women? Stormcasts actually do this quite well. And, they've got slightly smaller proportions. They've got different torso armor, but the legs and arms are noticeably smaller, which is a painful kit bashing for when I've been doing my Thunder Warriors, because obviously I'm doing all my Thunder Warriors as men because they're basically precursors to Space Marines. But also just the scale of the female Stormcast is just slightly too small. It's really noticeable, even if it's only a millimeter or two difference in terms of like the thickness of the legs and the arms, and it just isn't really compatible with the Space Marine torsos that I'm using. So for every box of 5 miniatures I'm buying for my Thunder Warriors that are Stormcast, 2 of them I'm having to just not use at all and completely just put to one side because they're the female part. So from a kit bashing perspective, having distinct body shapes is terrible, whereas the Custodes are ultimately the same regardless, and it's just a head swap, which does make things a lot easier to do. But then it's, how do you put in those female features? Is it just on the head? And they've obviously on one case gone for a big long lot of hair because that's just an easy signifier. And they talk about how down to the genetics and cellular level they're exactly the same, flawless above all, and there's no difference in combat efficiency between the two. So okay, cool. I guess here's the thing. Has it changed the law? Yes. Is it the end of the world? Not really. Was I annoyed about it last year? Yeah, kind of, because it was a bit of a law change. And I like the idea that you had the Sisters of Silence and the Custodes being a mixed faction of male and female specific archetypes. And now what you have is Custodes being male and female and Sisters being female. It's not like in Space Marines where being a brotherhood is very foundational to the identity of Space Marines. I don't think you could really introduce female Space Marines without undoing a lot more of the identity of Space Marines. Whereas Custodes, I think they're a bit more mythical, and I think it's not the end of the world. So was I more annoyed last year than I am now? Yes. Have the Games Workshop gone about it in the best way possible? I don't think so. I think they could have rolled this out a lot better. My take last year was, if you're going to introduce the animation, give us some female models at the same time. In an ideal world, they should have just done this all back in 7th edition and sort of stuck with their guns back then. And I don't think anyone would have really cared back then. I think the biggest thing that they've done here is explicitly state that law-wise Space Marines are men. And I mean, they haven't said they always will be, but that is sort of the implication. There are no female Adeptus Astartes. And I think a lot of the pushback from the idea of female Custodes is the worry that they will push this to the next level, which is female Astartes. And effectively, they said they're not doing that. So I think that ultimately is a sort of close and shut case for that sort of argument, which I think is good. Other people might disagree for whatever reason, and that's fine. Does this create any new interesting stories that you can tell with Custodes? No. Having females in Custodes doesn't really add anything. I think from a sort of interesting story-wise perspective, does it give people that play Custodes female representation? Yes. And I sort of feel like that's ultimately why they've wanted to do it. Obviously, there's been rumors about things like, the Neville show on Amazon. Maybe they want a female character that is in power armor. So maybe that's why they've been pushing for female Custodes. I mean, who knows? I think just generally people want the idea of there being, female models in 40k. And I think that's a good thing. And actually, there is technically now female models in both the Space Marines and Chaos Marine range as well, because with Huron Blackheart's ensemble of models, you've got 2 female models. One of them's the human Navy commander. The other one is the female alien. And then with Titus's cohort, you've also got a bunch of female human characters there. And I sort of suspect that is one of the reasons why they've added those in, is to allow there to be effectively female representation and diversity within those very male-centric armies.
And technically, even within Sisters of Battle, you do have some male miniatures. Admittedly, they are tied to the penitent engines, but they do technically exist as well, even though I don't think they're actual Sisters of Battle. I guess Sisters of Silencer is probably the only range that is now a sort of, single sex faction if we're going down the sort of nuts and bolts of it. Obviously, you've got things like orcs, which are, fungus and what have you. Anyway, that is some ramblings and musings about female Custodes. I'd be interested to know if you're putting your hair out or if you're chilled with it or if you think it's good. You can let me know down in the comments. And hopefully my take's been rather balanced and not frothing at the mouth. So yeah, that is it for Custodes. Let's move on to the rest of the Heresy range. On with the theme of Heresy, we've got some other new models, specifically vehicles. So we've got the Glaive Super Heavy Special Weapon Tank with a huge, I think, Volkite gun on here, which looks pretty cool. Yeah, so it says it's got the Vulcanite carronade, which is this huge turret-mounted weapon, and obviously on the sponsons you've got these quad las cannons on either side, so packs a lot of punch. And then in the hull, it looks like it's got a twin flamer option. So like I said before, with the Custodes stuff, this will be pretty much a one-for-one redesign of the old resin kits. So it will be much lighter, it'll be much cheaper within reason, and, not necessarily actually easier to build because it will just be so many parts. But in terms of transporting and, overall ease of construction, yes, it technically will be because you won't have to deal with resin. But there are some charms of resin where, the entire side piece of the track will be probably one big piece of resin, which, yes, you need to clean and wash and, add a tiny bit of track on where the casting gate was. But that will go together so much quicker than the 50 pieces that you will probably need to assemble that one track. So there is an element of resin, which is actually a joy to build once you get into it. And obviously I've been doing it for quite a long time now, so I've become a bit of an expert at the finicky details of resin and knowing how to deal with the problems, but also the benefits of resin. Whereas a lot of people just can't get past that. So I totally understand why plastic is king for most people. I have one weird takeaway when it comes to the plastic tanks, and that is they're just too crisp. Like the straight edges on the vehicles are just flawlessly flat, which is, what you want from a plastic, but it gives it a slight uncanny valley to it. Whereas the old resin vehicles, there's a little bit of wobble to the flat surfaces, which ultimately looks more realistic from a scale model point of view. It looks more like an actual vehicle because large scale tanks aren't going to be uniformly flat, flush surfaces. There's going to be a little bit of texture to it. There's going to be a little bit of denting and warping and things like that, which that is the one thing I sort of miss with the original old resin kits is there's a sort of a level of believability sort of baked into that natural sort of hand sculpted design and molding process that you unfortunately lose with, both the concept of 3D design, but also the plastic kits. I don't want to say it's soulless, but there was a real charm to a lot of the old resin kits, including vehicles, but especially like infantry characters and stuff like that. Then we're on to the less super heavy vehicles. We've got the Whirlwind missile tank. I love the old school sort of rhinos. I love this Whirlwind tank. It just reminds me of the old White Dwarf conversion guide that was in there. I did it for the Chimera. I don't know if there was a specific one for the Whirlwind, but basically it has that similar sort of look to it where you took the back of an old square base, like the monster size square bases, and in that you had all these circles, which would basically be your missile tubes. And that would be your front piece. You would like cut it in half and that would be your front piece. And then you would use a plasticard to build out the rest of the missile launcher bit.
And that's what this reminds me of. So sort of weirdly for nostalgia, this is like a 10 out of 10 model for me. It just looks fantastic. And then the coloring, like the way it's painted, like it's incredible. Yes, it's very much a heavy metal style rather than the old school Horus Heresy of the first edition. I think I'm coming round to it finally. But you know, I love that old school painting style as well. But yeah, the Whirlwind looks phenomenal. Got loads and loads of detail on it. It just looks gorgeous. And obviously, if you're a player of Heresy, you'll probably want to get hold of this. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of good enough that you could probably use it for the right army in 40k as well, even though there's a very different kit. And then this is all coming in a Journal Tactica, which are the small, not quite black books that they're producing for Heresy. This is called Mailed Fist, which talks about the Legion Astartes super heavy tanks. So it's going to have a bunch of rules, lore, image and artworks. And, you know, I think they go for around 15 quid. So they're relatively cheap for what they are, noting that they'll only really be valid for this edition. So that's something to always bear in mind. And that is it for the Heresy part of the preview. Well, we're now doing the 5-star review. But before we get into the 5-star review, I'd just like to thank everyone for sitting through this solo show of mine. Thank you very much to the listeners. Thank you especially to the Patreon supporters. And thank you to everyone else in between. If you'd like to support us, you can leave a comment below. You can share it with your friends. You just tell everyone that you could possibly care about to listen to the show. Lastly, we have merch on Red Level where you can buy a lovely t-shirt of ours, and you can also support us on Patreon. If you just Google Lookouts 40k Patreon, it will come up with the correct link, and there'll be also links in the description of the show notes as well. So any support is greatly appreciated. It will no doubt be going to fund purchasing books, the very expensive studio editing software that I'm currently editing this on, and also probably getting some new equipment as and when it is needed. So any support is super appreciated, but also just listening. That's all you need to do. Don't feel obliged to do anything else. So let's get on with the 5-star review, a segment I was entirely happy to can, but I sort of felt like because there were a couple more 5-star reviews, because we had run out, but now there is some, I feel like, yeah, let's just go through them. Let's try and maintain it. There's no jingle. There's no Dan passing it back to me. It's just me reading it all out. So this one comes from Captain Cortez from Apple Podcasts of United Kingdom. He says, top banana. Listened since day dot, dipped in and out due to life, etc. But like true internet friends, they are always there when you need them. Like a little hobby cuddle when you need a pickup. Don't ever go away, my imaginary internet buddies. Well, sadly, one of us has, but one of us still remains. Hopefully, one buddy is more buddies than you actually need. So thank you very much, Captain Cortez. Appreciate your kind comments, even though this was clearly written before Dan had left. So sad times all round, but the show will carry on. Thank you very much and keep listening. Now we go on to the Patreon questions and community comments. So in the last section of the show, I just wanted to go through some community comments and questions that I posted up on Patreon a couple of days ago. So here they are. So John says, glad to read the podcast continues. Thank you. And a thank you from me back to you, John. I'm glad you're hopefully enjoying this episode. Alex says, thoughts on the lore retcon of female Custodes, Iron Warriors, new drops, definitely going to be Perturabo drop. Gets Joe's opinion since he's done Iron Warriors for a very high number of times. I'm not reading the number out, it's too long. Red Corsairs, I think the face of Huron is goofy looking. And the new Kill Team box set with sisters, I don't know why they have witch hunters going after Night Lords. Night Lords aren't super psychery.
Right, let's try and address a few things one at a time. Firstly, the retcon of female Custodes, I pretty much have covered, I think, quite in detail in the episode. I think it is going to be much like Marmite here in the UK. You either love it or you hate it. I do think, there's a lot of toxic discussion around it, especially against the people that don't like the change, and I don't think that's great for either side of the debate, whether you are pro or against it. I think sort of both opinions are valid. And I ultimately think the reason why people obsess over these things isn't because they hate women and they just want the hobby to be for men only. I think it's something that felt like it was a real law change, and no one likes a law change. No one just likes change in general when it comes to anything, let alone a hobby that people are super passionate about. And a lot of these people are, really, really dedicated and passionate about this hobby and get hung up on really small bits of detail. When I was talking about Custodes, I was banging on about the lack of trigger on the Guardian Spear because I noticed that people were nitpicking at that to death on the internet. It's like these tiny little bits of detail people really obsess over. So they're obviously going to be much more vocal when it comes to the much more bigger changes. So I think that is all I'll say on that matter. Yes, Iron Warriors has some really interesting reveals. Perturabo would be really interesting if it comes out. It feels like they would do Perturabo if they were going to do like a big Emperor's Children style release, because obviously Fulgrim came out with the Emperor's Children. It would be sort of silly to not do Perturabo at the same time. But we'll see what they do. Is it just going to be like the Night Lords, where it's like a kill team upgrade sprue, or like the Red Corsairs, where it's a couple of units, but they're not a dedicated standalone release? They're just going to be like a little flavoring sprinkle on top of effectively the Chaos Space Marine Codex. That will be key. Yeah, Joe is originally the first person from the podcast to leave. He is John Lennon of the group. He has gone on to bigger and better things. And yeah, he's a big Iron Warriors fan. So it'll be interesting to see his take on them when they come out. Yeah, Huron's face. Huron, yeah, definitely a goofy looking face. Personally, it's grown on me, and I actually think it is giving him a very unique personality with that face, even if it is a touch goofy. And potentially a lot of that is down to the paint job. I do find if you paint it in a bit more of a grimdark style, you can take some of the levity out of it and give it a bit more of a serious tone. So once the Warhammer community article comes up with different paint jobs from around the community, I think that'll be quite interesting to see. And there has definitely been times when I've not liked a miniature, but then as soon as I've seen other people paint it in different styles, it's actually, I've kind of come around to it. So that could happen with this. And then lastly, the box set with the sisters. So I thought it would actually be quite interesting to just share what the Kill Team Shadowhunt actually looks like and sort of read into the lore description about the sisters that are battling the Night Lords. A cold pool of terror settles across the industrial world of Garonux. Into this simmering cauldron of fear and discontent comes a murder wing of Night Lords. These bloodthirsty butchers have come to hunt, and not only the living. Somewhere beneath the city of St. Mernier's heart, a dread power stirs, and the murder wing will stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. Meanwhile, sallying forth from a soaring tower of their order's cathedral sanctuary, witch-hunting Celestine Insidiants stalk the streets as they pursue the trail of bloodshed and heresy. A confrontation inevitably awaits. So that is the sort of setting and the lore behind it. And then here are obviously the miniatures. The Night Lords ones, which I was explaining recently, are dreadful in my opinion. But the actual Sisters ones, they do look pretty good. So let's have them up while I talk through the concept of, yes, it says they're witch hunters. How much of that is really metaphorical, or are they actually hunting witches and psychers? Because, the Sisters of Battle are very much all about, quite often it's like the internal threat from within the Imperium, when you get the Witch, the Heretic, the Psychers, the Mutants, the Xenos. In terms of the orders, these are very much still focused against that kind of corrupting warp effect. So, yeah, Night Lords aren't maybe traditional Psychers per se, or witches, as how they're being described by the Sisters of Battle. But that doesn't mean Sisters of Battle doesn't fight those things. Sisters of Battle find themselves on all sorts of planets, fighting and battling against all sorts of things, even if it's not their specific wheelhouse of the thing they would normally be hunting. So I think maybe the theme, you could argue, is slightly off and has maybe been a bit forced, because they just, they have two different miniature rangers that they want to put together, and they will try and do that. But then I also think equally, if you were trying to have a, witch-esque unit, I think that's almost narrowing themselves too much in terms of what they could be pitched up against. So I can genuinely see why they've just gone for a, let's say, generic chaos adversary, and not one leaning into their psychic ability, even if the point of this unit is to sort of hunt down witches. So, yeah, there is maybe a slight disconnect between what the law is stating that their intended purposes versus what the, practical purposes of how they're being used in this box set is. So, sort of a fair point. But also they can kind of do what they want because they're Games Workshop, right? One thing worth noting out, which I didn't realise in this box set before, and that is this. So you get a little play mat, and it has a few different sides. So I think you actually get two mats in here, one of which is for effectively boarding actions with a classic Gallo Dark style texture, and then the other one is specifically for the Necrons, have a new Necron themed terrain, and then one of the others is two different sort of sides. One, I think, was the Octarius kind of orc style desert, and then there's another kind of bluish tone battleground as well. So that's just interesting to note. So I thought I'd point that out because I didn't realize it came with that. So that is quite cool. The next question is from Phil, and he says, is it worth getting red Corsairs to convert for Night Lords? Do you think the Raiders are chosen size to proxy? So in the background, I've got the chosen models up so we can look at those. I think size-wise, it's perfectly fine to run the new Raiders as the chosen, and in a way you could argue they are kind of the red Corsairs specific chosen, because the chosen are elites of the veterans of the Long War, basically the elite Legionnaire unit. And I think the Raiders are effectively the red Corsair version of that. And what is actually quite interesting is some of the models are actually quite similar in terms of their loadout. So you can see here, they've got a real mix of kind of close combat and shooting weapons. You got the leader with the mace, which I don't think there was necessarily a comparison with the red Corsairs. I think one of them there was a couple with swords. This guy, there is a guy with a power fist, which is very similar to one of the Raiders, because he also had a power fist and a pistol. And then there's another guy with lightning claws, which isn't at all really comparable with the Raiders. But I think you could definitely kit bash the Raiders to look like these guys. I guess the real issue is, would you want to run the Raiders as a unit on their own? And then in addition to that, would you like to take a box of Raiders and convert them as chosen, or to run them as chosen? Because what you need to do is you need to make sure that there's enough sort of visual distinction between your converted chosen unit and the standard Raider unit. So that will be a sort of tricky thread to weave, I think, but it is certainly possible. And if you look at some of the close-up shots, you do get an interesting mix of, chain axes, power axes, and sort of special weapons. So I think, there's going to be a lot of similar loadout options between the two kits, so I think it would be quite straightforward to probably run the Raiders as the Chosen. I think that would be a good choice if you just don't like the Chosen kit. And as I was saying throughout the entire duration of that Red Corsairs portion of the video, I'm not a real fan of this overly overt chaos embellishments on Chaos Space Marines. So actually, this is a fantastic idea, Phil. And this isn't me, even though he is called Phil S. I am not that Phil S. There is another Phil out there with clearly the same initials as me. But it's a great idea, and I'll probably, if I do the Red Corsairs, I will be borrowing this idea and, yeah, kit bashing some Raiders into Chosen just so I have more unit choices. And likewise, what I would probably do is either use those Raider minis or some Heresy minis and convert them into kind of Chaos Legionnaires, so they're a bit more like generic Chaos Warriors, but toning them down and making sure there's enough visual distinction between the two. I think sort of model scale wise and base sizes, they will be on the same basis, so I don't think there'd be any problem from that perspective. So thank you, Phil. That is a great comment. Then we have two last comments. One is from Andrew. It says, They suggested the 30k Custodes could be usable in 3K. How do you think they will be packaged? Seems like Games Workshop are actively working to make sure ranges weren't cross-compatible across systems, so this feels like quite the departure. You are correct to an extent. As I mentioned in the podcast, the Knights and the Custodes have always kind of straddled both systems simultaneously, and it is actually quite interesting that they aren't really doing this here. It'll be interesting to see what they do. This might be actually the first time where they are going to depart the lines, even though the rules are still going to be effectively cross-compatible. Are these models going to be specifically branded Horus Heresy Custodes, and the current K/Heresy plastic Custodes will just be now the 40k Custodes? That is entirely plausible, especially when you have things like the Blade Champion and the new Captain miniature that had the Pythorite Melter Spear, which was a terrible sculpt. So I could see them wanting to keep the 40k one specific because a lot of the other 40k minis have their own stuff going on, and likewise the Alaris Terminators, like they all fit in design wise together, and these new Heresy minis do look very unique. But I think it's like that's not necessarily a problem. What will be a problem is if they were to turn around at some point and say, well, the Heresy miniatures, especially the vehicles that don't have 40k equivalents, are going to Legends. Now, they've not made any indication that that's going to be the case. It feels very unlikely that that would be the case, purely because I think a lot of people would struggle with Custodes without that. And the fact that they've always done it, and same with Knights, that they've always had that kind of cross-compatibility, it might be they're just going to sort of separate out as much of the model range as possible, but allow some cross-compatibility between them, I think is probably what they will do. But it'll be interesting to see, Games Workshop says one thing in this article and, just hinted that they are compatible in 40k, but they may well turn around and go, yeah, but actually a lot of the vehicles are actually all moving to Legends in the same way that Contemptors and Leviathans did for Space Marines. And that would be a real shock and a shame, but it won't be that surprising because Games Workshop has had precedence in doing that. Despite me saying during the episode, that would be a bit of a financial disaster for them, because I suspect a lot of the people that are buying those things are 40k players. But that was the same with Contemptors and Leviathans too. I think the justification maybe with the Space Marines is their range is already big enough as it is, and actually toning it down, especially when it comes to the competitive scene, is actually probably for the best. Whereas Custodes has such a small model range, it can deal with having those extra units ported into 40k. Last comment is from Dan. not our Dan, a different Dan, says, really interested to see where they go with Disciples of Tzeentch for AOS when the new Battle Tome is released. I honestly found the 40k stuff they announced to be very meh. Well, it's a shame you didn't like the 40k stuff. I personally found it really fantastic, to be honest, but then it just happened to tick all the boxes that I really enjoyed. I've always really liked the idea of Corsairs for Eldari. I've always really liked the idea of Red Corsairs. There's a Space Marine army, and I've been collecting a pseudo Custodes army for a while, so it feels like this VK release was mostly tailored to my interests. And obviously that won't be for everyone. The Disciples of Tzeentch actually looked really interesting, and while I haven't sort of done a sort of reaction to those models, or the one model that they did have, that was a very cool mini that they revealed for them. And yeah, the rules for Disciples of Tzeentch have always been really interesting. They've always had a sort of bribery mechanic, I guess, in AOS, where you can offer your opponent some dice, and if they accept, you also get some kind of benefit to it, but if they refuse, something else might happen. So yeah, rules wise, they've always been quite interesting in Age of Sigmar, so it'll be interesting to see what they do with that. Please do reach out and let me know your thoughts when that Battle Tome drops, because it sounds like you're a player of that army, so I'd always be interested to hear from someone what their take is on an army that I don't personally play in Age of Sigmar. So that is the end of the first solo show by myself. I appreciate you all sitting around, doing whatever you're doing, listening to me babble on for a couple of hours. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. And as I said earlier in the show, please let me know via comments or messaging what you think, what improvements you would like to see, and I will see what I can do. Next episode, which will probably be out in a couple of weeks, is going to, fingers crossed, be a recap of the Age of Sigmar doubles event that I did with Dan, Tim, and Richard. Hopefully Tim and Richie will be able to join us on the show to talk about some of our games and generally how we got on at the event. I teamed up with Tim, Richie teamed up with Dan, and obviously Dan can't join us, sadly. But it'll be great to get their perspective on the show. And also, so it's not always a solo show. Hopefully it'll be something a bit different. And then going on from there, I've got the Crusade Armageddon book review lore dump that I would like to do. Then also I've just got the 500 Worlds campaign book, and myself and Richie and Dan are joining a 500 Worlds campaign that is being run by Spike, who is one of Richie's friends. So that will be very good to do from a hobby perspective, and hopefully we get to talk about that a bit more in detail when that starts in February. So that is all for now. It is the end of the show. Thank you so much for sticking around and listening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.